Hi, everybody. Welcome to the How to Read Philosophy module. Now, reading philosophy is going to be a lot different than reading other types of works that you may be familiar with. For instance, uh, typical textbooks, books of fiction. Um, these aren't typically structured in the same way. Take a textbook, for instance. A textbook is often written in an informational sense, in that it's just providing information to you. And so the more you can memorize the material in that textbook, the more you'll come away with. Philosophy, on the other hand, is much different. You're reading arguments for a position to address the understanding of a topic, and these are not as clear cut. Doing philosophy is different, difficult. Trying to summarize or simplify very um, complex concepts can be very difficult. And so when we read philosophy, it's a much more active process than just reading a textbook. And part of the reason that it's such an active process is because you're having to do a lot of the work when it comes to looking up what the arguments are or understanding the arguments. It's important to consider objections, right? Something that we don't typically do when we read textbooks. When we read a textbook about history or chemistry, for instance, we're learning about certain molecules or times and places that events occurred. And these aren't, for the most part, up for debate. They're basically factual information, historical information. But philosophy is much different. Philosophy is argumentative, it's meant to be persuasive. And so it's not quite clear that the author of the work has been or is providing factual information. They're trying to do work to deduce information or induce information, whether they're using deductive or inductive logic. And so it can be a lot of work to consider objections, possible counter arguments, or paradoxes or thought experiments that might go into proving a point incorrect, or thinking of other examples of your own that might go into supporting a position. And so there's a lot that goes into reading philosophy, and most of that it revolves around just being a good critical thinker, which takes us back to kind of the first week of this class and really understanding what critical thinking is and different characteristics for being a good critical thinker. Now, some steps that can help you to become a better reader of philosophy is to first understand the relevant historical information. Now, this is important because remember, within philosophy works, there's essentially an agenda, right? We're trying to prove a specific point, and those points are often proved because of the um, desire or the bias or just the kind of ingrained understanding of the author. And so knowing the historical information of the time, knowing historical information about the person, whether or not they suffered with depression, may give us a glimpse into um, where the argument originates from and potentially leads us to problems that could arise with that bias. And so it's important to kind of understand the historical relevance of the time period and perhaps even just kind of factual information of the author, which goes into the kind of second step, which is understanding dates and original language. So, for instance, if we were to read Descartes in his native French, it might be a little bit different, especially considering it's 16th century French, than if we were to read it today in the 21st century in English. A lot of things are often lost in translation, and it's important that when we're reading philosophy, right, we're trying to really understand what the author is saying. And so if their use of language in the 16th century doesn't literally translate well to our 21st century language, then we might not be doing the argument justice that we're trying to support or object against. So for instance, take for instance, if your grandparent were to express an idea to you, and because of the time period and perhaps even a difference in language, if your ancient relatives speak a different language, then there might be a loss of clarity within that translation, within that time period. And so we might not get all that we're needing to get out of that information. And so it's important to know the original language and the time frame in which something was written so that we can really do justice to understanding what the other person is trying to say. Because remember, a philosophy work is a persuasive piece of work, which means someone is creating an argument for why something is the case. And so understanding what that person is trying to say is paramount to reading philosophy and doing philosophy. And so it's important that we give that benefit of the doubt to the writer based on their historical factual information and time and language in which they wrote. Another important step to help us with reading philosophy is to become familiar with key terms and vocabulary. No matter what discipline you're studying, there's going to be a strict vocabulary. If you're studying computers, then there is computer lingo. If you're studying medicine, there is medical terminology. And it's imperative that these pieces of vocabulary, these key terms, are understood, because it's typically these terms that are going to be the important concepts when studying philosophy or perhaps another discipline, but particularly with philosophy, because philosophy relies on consistency and understanding what is often thought to be very simplistic concepts. For instance, I might think about using the word justice, and the word justice may mean something differently to a philosopher who's writing about justice than if we were to just in passing talk about what's just and what's not just. And so understanding key vocabulary terms, important terms that are used within the piece of writing are going to be very important to, again, understand and clarify what is actually being written. Because again, remember, our job as philosophers, or our job when it comes to reading philosophy or persuasive arguments for that matter, is to simplify and understand these arguments so that we can better evaluate them and then determine our course of action based on that evaluation. Another key and important step when it comes to reading philosophy is to understand how arguments can be flawed. Now, this is some of the stuff that we've already covered in this class. Remember, there are two ways, for instance, that a deductive argument can be flawed. It can either be unsound or it could be invalid, meaning that the structure is not put together well, or some premise or proposition, some assertion is false. So with deductive arguments, remember, they can be flawed in a couple of ways, and then there are hundreds of fallacies that can be committed as well. And therefore, recognizing, remembering those fallacies help us when it comes to understanding arguments and determining and evaluating whether or not those arguments are good. If somebody expresses a fallacious argument, it's up to me to understand what is bad about that argument, what is problematic, why it commits a certain fallacy, and why that essentially ruins the argument. When it comes to inductive arguments, we see that there are a number of fallacies as well, if you'll remember from earlier in this class, and that not only are there a number of fallacies, but we also often tend to just do the mental math um, incorrectly when we're trying to deal with statistics and numbers in our head. We're often very bad at doing that mental arithmetic. We often confuse causation with correlation and just judge coincidences as very unprobable things when in reality they are very probable. And so it's important to understand where arguments can go wrong, because then we can pick out when and if arguments are bad and why, so that we know whether or not we should be persuaded by arguments or not persuaded by arguments. If I can recognize the flaw within an argument, then it certainly won't be one that persuades me into believing the author's position. Similarly, if I know why an argument is flawed and this particular argument that I'm reading is not flawed, then I will know why I am being persuaded by this argument. And so it's really important to understand what makes arguments good and how we can recognize good from bad arguments, right? Using the logic aspect of being a good critical thinker. Now, there are also steps that we want to think about in terms of the process that goes into reading philosophy. Again, reading philosophy is a little bit more active than reading other material. It's not just about reading and trying to commit things to memory. It's about trying to understand, evaluate, judge, really determine whether or not an argument is good or bad, whether we should believe something or not believe something. And so there are a number of different ways in which we can go about reading philosophy, or different methods for doing this. I tend to think that there are 4 just pretty clear-cut steps to the reading philosophy process. The first is pre-reading. After that, just kind of give it a quick read through, then really read for understanding, and then once you really understand the text, then you can evaluate it. And so we'll talk about each one of these in turn. The pre-reading portion or step to this process is pretty easy. It's all about just looking at the basics of the work and getting yourself into the right mindset to read philosophy. And so this means looking at the table of contents, knowing how many pages you're going to read so that you can mentally prepare for what it is that you're going to read. Notice section headers, footnotes, chapters. Just get a very, very rough idea of the topic that you're going to be reading about. And so the goal of this pre-reading stage is to just get a sense of the structure and the aim of the paper. What's the paper about? How is it going to be organized? That way, you know exactly what you're in for, and ultimately how the author is going to get to whatever the position is that they're focusing on, right? Whatever their main thesis is, the paper is going to be organized in a way to really highlight that thesis. So if we know the organization, then that way we can, when it comes time to understand the thesis, we can really just kind of understand the writer's process for why they think that particular thesis is going to be true. And so just by reading the abstract, just by looking at how a paper is organized, we might not get a clear understanding of the abstract, or a clear understanding of the thesis statement, and that's fine. If that's the case, then we're just going to read the first and last paragraph of the essay. Usually a good piece of writing, and this is something that I'm going to stress in this class, right? A good piece of writing in the first paragraph should have the argument laid out. You should have a clear-cut thesis, the position that you're trying to persuade the reader to believe, and premises or reasons for why that particular thesis statement is true. That needs to, or ought to be, identified in the very first paragraph so that the reader knows where you're going and how you're going to get there. And then in the last paragraph, it's going to kind of summarize all of that in addition to creating some call to action or explaining some other avenues of study. And so by reading the first and last paragraph, you're really understanding the thesis, the argument, and the purpose of the writing. And that's really what we're after, particularly with philosophy, in addition to the nuances that we're going to talk about here in a minute. The next step is to read the article quickly. Just read it from start to finish. Maybe you're looking up definitions of words you don't know, making just really brief notes. But this is meant to be just a quick read through and to see what's in the paper. Not even necessarily to understand all the different ins and outs, all the different arguments, but just to see what's in the paper. Now, this is kind of an annoying part about reading philosophy, is that it's going to require multiple read-throughs. We might not think that typical textbooks require this. Philosophy books tend to be very dense, and so it requires a quick read-through to just kind of understand the tone in which the essay is being written, to just try to understand where the author is going, and then a more careful read through to really get at the nuances, the arguments, and all the other stuff that's really important when it comes to philosophizing and trying to really understand what's being asserted. So when it comes to the quick reading step of the reading process, the goal is to just get the most basic understanding of the piece of work that's being written, so that if you had to explain to somebody what it was you were reading, you could just tell someone else what the article is about. Not that you really have to defend it, not that you really have to go into the intricacies of the argument, just this is what the argument's about, this is what the author is trying to do. After you've read it through quickly, it's important, and perhaps the most important step, is to read it for understanding. This is the slow, delicate process of reading philosophy. You're reading the article slowly, taking notes, and you're making sure you understand what the argument is that's being laid out. Knowing the different premises, what the conclusion is, how the premises link up to the conclusion, considering counter arguments or counter examples, coming up with material that synthesizes or analyzes the information that you're reading. And so the goal here is to really understand the author's argument and how they're supporting the conclusion. This is a slow reading process. Now that you know what the essay is about, you can go in and think to yourself, okay, well, I know they're trying to make the case that X is true, X being the thesis. So if I know that this is about X being true, what are the reasons for why that is the case? How does the author go about justifying those reasons? And so this is the time when it's you're really getting into the philosophy aspect. It's often the case for me that in this stage, I read much, much slower. I can typically read uh, 30, 40, 50 pages in an hour of a fiction book or a textbook. It's not uncommon to take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to read 10 pages for philosophy because it requires reading something and then rereading it and rereading again to understand what is being said. And so this is a time consuming stage. This is a time consuming step within the process of reading philosophy. But if you're able to get through this step, then understanding the author's argument and understanding the purpose of the piece of work is going to be that much clearer, and your understanding is going to help you to determine how it is that you're going to evaluate all of the different arguments and justifications that are being expressed in the piece of work. And so step 4, the last step, once we really understand the argument, we can evaluate it. What are the objections and how do those objections sway me to believe one thing or another? Or do they sway me to believe one thing or another? Were there mistakes? Were there fallacies? Is there something that the author did incorrectly? Also, it's important during the evaluation stage to think about how the argument can be stronger. Remember, when we read philosophy, the goal is to become more aware or to learn something and get a greater sense of knowledge and understanding. If we're reading something and the argument is flawed, it's important to use the principle of charity and to think about what would make that argument better. Remember, when you're reading something in philosophy, you are on the same team as the person who's writing. So the goal is not to find out why they're wrong and then call it out and rub it in their face. The goal is to gain a better understanding of the material, and that requires to take information that's relevant and to think about how that information would make the best persuasive case that it could. And this often requires not criticizing the author for failing to take recent research into account. For instance, if I'm going back and I'm reading ancient Greek philosophy, I'm not going to criticize Aristotle and Plato because they don't understand psychology or neuroscience. That's not a discipline back then. There isn't a strong scientific background back then compared to what we know now in science. And so just because they got something wrong in psychology or neuroscience doesn't mean I'm going to criticize that. I'm going to take what makes sense from their writing and I'm going to try and think of a way to apply that to how the world is now or how we understand the world now and see from there whether or not a good argument can be made based on what the author was saying. Now, it may turn out to be the case that it's still going to be a bad argument, regardless if I take the recent research into account, and that's fine. But it's important to provide that principle of charity, that sense that you are on the same team as the reader. So don't go and try and criticize just because someone's writing in an earlier time period where they don't quite understand certain aspects of the world as compared to what we do now. A couple other tips, just kind of beyond this process that we've been talking about. It's important that whenever we read philosophy, we're approaching the text with an open mind. This means that when we read something, we acknowledge the fact that we need to be open to being persuaded by the author, which means your beliefs going into reading something aren't always the better belief or more correct position. So if I'm a die-hard atheist and I'm reading a theistic argument, I can't go in thinking, well, all these arguments are not going to be good because I know that atheism is the best option, the best argument for um, the non-existence of a God. It's important that we go in understanding that all of our positions, or that all of our beliefs, most of our beliefs, could be incorrect, and that we need to leave the door open to be proven wrong. That way, we're reading with an open mind, and we're leaving open the idea that we could be wrong, and that information that we're reading can help us to understand the world a bit better. Similarly, don't just assume somebody's correct because they're famous. So for instance, if I'm going to read an argument about astrophysics by Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm not just going to assume that, oh, no matter what he writes is going to be gold. It's going to be accurate and correct. Just because he's a famous astrophysicist doesn't necessarily mean that his theoretical physics, when it comes to astronomy, it is always going to be correct. That's not the case. So we always want to just keep an open mind to be persuaded one way or the other. That way, we're really just looking out for what makes the best argument, and we're letting the information take us to a place of understanding. We're not trying to manipulate the information to fit into our schemes or our theories. Another good piece of information when it comes to reading philosophy is to outline the argument. Reconstructing the argument, or writing down what the conclusion and what the premises are, is going to be incredibly helpful for your understanding. Not only does reconstructing or outlining the argument helpful when it comes to recognizing flaws and fallacies, but it also helps when it comes to just remembering what that piece of reading was about, so that you don't have to continually go back and reread the same information. Outlining, note-taking is an important part so that you don't have to go through all of the steps over again, spend a lot of time going through the dense readings to find the different aspects of the argument. So really writing down the argument in an outline is going to be helpful for just understanding the argument and memorizing the argument even better. So if you follow these tips and you follow this process, you will be reading incredibly actively, and it's going to be very not only time consuming, but it's going to consume a lot of your energy. That's how you know you are doing it well. We often think that reading is this kind of passive project that we can do. We can relax and sit in a chair and just read. But to read philosophy, because it is such an active undertaking, we should feel tired after doing it. It's difficult to do. It takes a lot of mental energy, but when we do it right, we get a greater sense of understanding, not just what other people have believed, but we get a better understanding of the world, better understanding of arguments, how to rationalize information, and we become better critical thinkers.